The hospital hallways were nearly empty. The usual rush of doctors and nurses, replaced by a quiet stillness that came only in the late hours of the night. Most of the staff had already gone home, the bright fluorescent lights casting long shadows on the polished floors. But in one of the pediatric rooms, Nurse Emily sat beside a small hospital bed, her warm hand gently resting over the tiny fingers of a scared little boy. His name was Oliver, barely 6 years old, and he had just undergone surgery earlier that day. His mother, exhausted and worried, had stepped out for a brief moment to grab a cup of coffee, leaving Oliver alone in the unfamiliar room. Tears welled up in his wide, frightened eyes as he clutched a stuffed bear against his chest. The beeping machines and distant murmurs of the night shift staff made everything feel colder, scarier. Emily had been about to clock out, her long shift finally over. But something in Oliver's trembling voice had stopped her. He had reached for her hand, his tiny fingers gripping hers with a quiet desperation. "Please don't go," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily's heart squeezed. She had seen fear before. Children waking up from anesthesia, disoriented and afraid. Parents unable to stay overnight due to work or other responsibilities. She had spent years in these hallways, watching over kids who just needed someone to tell them it was going to be okay. She glanced at the clock, knowing she should be heading home, but how could she? With a soft sigh, she pulled a chair closer and smiled down at him. "I'm right here, sweetheart. You're not alone." Oliver's breathing steadied just a little, his fingers still wrapped around hers. Emily adjusted the blanket over him, humming a soft lullaby, like she used to for her own nephew when he was scared of thunderstorms. Slowly, his little body relaxed, though his eyes still flickered open every now and then to make sure she was still there. Unbeknownst to Emily, someone else had been watching. In the dimly lit hallway just outside the room, a man stood silently. He had been passing by, taking an unusual late-night stroll through the hospital. After visiting someone in another ward, dressed in an expensive suit, his presence was out of place against the sterile walls and the quiet hum of medical equipment. But something had drawn him to pause. Perhaps it was the soft melody of Emily's voice, or the gentle patience with which she stayed by the boy's side long after her shift had ended. The man observed for a while, unnoticed, a mixture of curiosity and something deeper stirring in his chest. He had seen plenty of hospitals, met countless medical staff in his lifetime, but there was something about this nurse, something selfless, something genuine. As he turned to leave, an idea took root in his mind. Something told him this woman deserved more than just silent admiration. She deserved something bigger, something life-changing, and he knew exactly how to make that happen. Emily didn't think much of staying late that night. To her, it was second nature, an unspoken part of why she had chosen this job in the first place. She had always believed that kindness, no matter how small, could make all the difference. And in Oliver's case, it did. Eventually, his little hand loosened its grip. His breathing became steady, and his eyes finally closed in peaceful sleep. With a quiet sigh of relief, Emily carefully stood up, making sure not to disturb him. She tucked the blanket around him one last time and glanced at the clock. It was well past her shift now, but she had no regrets. She gathered her things and left the room, heading toward the exit with tired steps. What she didn't know was that her small act of kindness had set something into motion, something far bigger than she could have imagined. The man who had witnessed the moment, Richard Lawson, was no ordinary hospital visitor. He was a businessman, one of the wealthiest in the city, known for his success in real estate and investments. But despite his wealth, he had never been someone who flaunted his fortune carelessly. He understood struggle. He had lived through it himself. Years ago, he had lost his wife to a long illness, and during that time, he had spent countless nights in hospital rooms just like this one. He had seen how overworked and underappreciated the nurses were, how they pushed past exhaustion to comfort not just their patients, but their families too. That night, seeing Emily stay by Oliver's side so selflessly brought back memories he had buried for a long time. The next morning, Richard found himself back at the hospital. But this time, he wasn't visiting a patient. He had asked to speak with the hospital's administration, requesting information about the nurse who had stayed late for Oliver. He wanted to know more about her, not in a way that invaded her privacy, but enough to understand who she was, what she had been through, and how he could help her in return. Meanwhile, Emily went about her usual routine, unaware of what was unfolding. She wasn't someone who expected recognition. She had been a nurse for nearly a decade, working long shifts, sacrificing holidays and weekends, often feeling the weight of the job in ways she couldn't always put into words. Lately, things had been even tougher. Her mother had fallen ill, and the medical bills were piling up. Emily was the sole provider, juggling her demanding job with taking care of her mother at home. There were days she barely had time to rest, but she never let it show. She smiled through it, for her patients, for her colleagues, for everyone except herself. That's why when she was unexpectedly called into the hospital director's office that afternoon, she felt a pang of anxiety. She quickly ran through the past few days in her mind. Had she made a mistake? Was something wrong? Stepping into the office, she was surprised to see not just the director, but also a man she didn't recognize. Richard stood there, his expression calm yet unreadable. The director motioned for her to take a seat, and Emily did, confusion swirling inside her. "Emily, this is Mr. Lawson," the director began. "He was here last night and witnessed something remarkable." She blinked, her tired mind struggling to piece things together. Richard spoke then, his voice steady but warm. "I saw what you did for that little boy, Oliver. You didn't have to stay, but you did. And that kind of kindness, it's rare. It reminded me of something I lost a long time ago." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I believe people like you deserve more than just appreciation. They deserve support." Emily frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. Richard reached into his pocket and placed a neatly folded paper on the table in front of her. "I want to do something for you, Emily, and I hope you won't refuse." The room fell silent. Emily hesitated before picking up the paper, her hands slightly trembling. As she unfolded it, her eyes widened. She was staring at a check with an amount so large it made her breath catch in her throat. This can't be right," she stammered, looking between the two men. "I don't understand." Richard smiled, though there was a deep sincerity in his gaze. "It's very real, Emily, and it's yours." Her heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just a small token of appreciation. It was life-changing. A sum that could wipe out her mother's medical debt, secure their future, and ease the burden she had carried for so long. But as the weight of the moment settled over her, another feeling crept in. Doubt. Could she accept something like this? Emily's hands shook as she stared at the check. The numbers blurred before her eyes, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She had spent years working tirelessly, never expecting anything in return beyond the quiet satisfaction of helping others. And now, in the span of a few moments, everything had changed. Richard watched her carefully, sensing the conflict in her expression. "You deserve this," he said gently. "This isn't charity, Emily. It's a thank you. Not just for last night, but for everything you do. every patient you care for, every long night you stay behind when no one else will. Emily swallowed hard. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. Her mother's medical bills, the mortgage she had been struggling to keep up with, the exhaustion that had settled so deeply into her bones. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be free of it. This money could change everything. But still, something inside her hesitated. I don't know if I can accept this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't do anything special. I just did my job. Richard smiled, shaking his head. That's exactly why you should accept it. Because people like you never ask for anything, even when they need it most. He leaned forward slightly. If you had the chance to change someone's life for the better, wouldn't you take it? Emily's chest tightened. Of course she would. That's why she became a nurse in the first place. She looked down at the check again, her fingers gripping the edges as reality sank in. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about feeling like she had to earn every bit of help. It was about allowing kindness to come full circle, just as she had given it so freely to others. A deep breath filled her lungs, and she finally met Richard's gaze. "Thank you," she said, emotion thick in her voice. "I don't even know what to say." Richard chuckled. "You don't have to say anything. Just keep being the person you are." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. But this time, they weren't from exhaustion or stress. They were from relief, gratitude, hope. Over the next few weeks, life changed in ways she had never imagined. The weight on her shoulders lightened as she paid off her mother's medical bills, ensuring she could get the best care without financial worry. For the first time in years, Emily took a moment for herself. Not because she was giving up her work, but because she finally had the ability to breathe. But despite everything, she remained the same person. She still stayed late when a scared child needed comfort. She still held the hands of patients who had no family by their side, because that's who she was. One evening, as she walked through the hospital halls, she noticed a nervous young nurse sitting outside a patient's room, looking overwhelmed. Emily smiled, remembering a time when she had felt the same way. She sat down beside her, offering the same reassurance she had once needed. Sometimes all someone needs is for you to just be there, she said softly. The young nurse looked at her, taking in the words. And in that moment, Emily knew. Kindness had a way of continuing. It didn't stop with her. It would keep moving forward, just as it always had. And that, more than anything, was the greatest gift of all.